I know you told your friend you're not okay, and tell me what's wrong and why you never said you felt that way. Guess you're trying to stay strong and fake a smile until I look away. But I've known you too long, it hurts to watch your blue eyes fade to gray as you fade away, as you fade away.
Yeah, I'm about to fade away, cause every time I wake up I feel like it's Monday. Something's going wrong with all the chemicals up in my brain. All of a sudden I don't look at anything the same way. Got a buildup of my thoughts sitting in an ashtray. I'm sorry that I'm so inconvenient, okay. Just let me be me and I'll stay out of your way. I can see the way you look at me, I'm such a disgrace. I never really asked to be brought into this place. You wanna love me? Well then baby I have a taste. All the highs and the lows, no you'll never be the same. I don't really wanna hurt you but I can't control the pain. If you're sticking by my side maybe we could be okay. Okay, maybe you could be the change I need today. I promise that I've never felt this way. I really hope that you will choose to stay through all the pain.
I know you told your friend you're not okay, and tell me what's
Wow, thanks, because I would have stayed muted apparently. Wow, that's never happened. Yeah, you got here before the intro was over. Yay, me. Hey, Triple. Hey, Cool Gamer. Yeah, I was muted. Sorry about that. Thanks for saying that, because I didn't think that I was. Everybody done Christmas shopping yet? Or has anybody even started? I started in the summer, and I have a feeling I'm going to be late again as usual. I always shop the last minute. I'm not muted anymore, right? Hope not. You haven't started? No. You can hear? Okay, good. All right, I'm just going to get started. You have nothing more important to do. So far, the people like this had yet to suffer any consequences for their actions. That rings true for a lot of damn people on these YouTube streets, that's for sure. Today was tough. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, girl. Having been found the legal owner of the bus, Manson spent 1 day in jail. Then he was released, along with the rest of the group. Okay, this is awful, but I'm pretty sure it's McCocken. McCocken. Yes, it is. That shouldn't be the last name. I'm sorry. My son's already bugging me to put the Christmas tree up. Hey, Teresa. You're in the kitchen? No way. Oh, good. I'm glad you're here. What are you making tonight? We had what? Pork chops and corn. McCocken, the chief of the Los Angeles probation office, was not happy about this. He had something of a personal stake in Manson's fate. All the way back in May 1960, he'd been the one to violate Manson's probation for failing to report to his supervisor, sending Manson back to federal prison. He had every intention of following a similar course this time, but he soon learned that while Manson's probation had been easy to violate in 1960, things were different now. In a letter to Wall, McCutcheon's straight face. What a stupid name. Oh, I cheated. I made stew in the crock pot. My house smells so yummy. Hey, that's not cheating. That's some good yummins. That's some good eatins. And a letter to Wal McCocken that said that Manson had personally appeared in her office to bring us up to date on the adventuresome nature. Claiming to have no interest in money or work, he had over 3,000 friends who were willing to give him any needed assistance. Manson said that he owned the school bus and that he and his girls have been traveling between San Francisco and Los Angeles in it for months. If anyone from the probation office needed to contact him, he could be reached through a friend named Gary Hinman of Topanga Canyon, the same Hinman whom the family would murder about a year later. Yummy. Manson had gall, but McCocken thought he gained the upper hand because Manson had since been arrested again, this time on a drug charge. Apparently, he was at that moment sitting in Los Angeles County Jail waiting arraignment. Sadly, McCocken was wrong. Manson had been released the previous day. For unknown reasons, the DA had declined to file charges. Not to be deterred, McCocken and Walda tried to rein in their wandering, law-breaking parolee. As the highest-ranking figure in their offices, they had a lot of clout, but not enough to catch Manson. Wall's most vigorous attempt came on June 3rd, 1968, when he sent a stern ultimatum to Manson's last two known addresses in San Francisco and Los Angeles. The latter belonged to Dennis Wilson. Because Wall didn't know Manson's exact whereabouts, he was forced to give him two options: report to U.S. Probation Office in either city immediately. Failure to follow this in direction, he wrote, will result in my recommending that a warrant for mandatory release violation be issued. From this point on, you are not to leave your current residence without written permission from a U.S. probation officer. Any permission given to you by Mr. Smith, who is no longer connected with the service, is hereby canceled. Give this matter your immediate attention. You have nothing more important to do. Manson defied the orders. Rather than showing up in person, he made a phone call to Wall, who was out of office, and furious to learn in a message taken by a subordinate that Manson had said he was living at Dennis Wilson's place and had been offered a $20,000 annual recording contract by the Beach Boys label. As Wall later wrote to McCocken, it would appear that Mr. Manson is on another LSD trip. This guy is insane. Like, I mean, obviously, but just the stuff that I read and how it's worded is a little funny. And of course, these names. So I'm definitely not trying to take this matter at hand here lightly. It's just a lot of the stuff is really comical, especially them admitting that it would appear that Mr. Manson is on another LSD trip, his probation officers. Still, at least they knew where Manson was living now. That was the step in the right direction, wasn't it? On June 6th, they sent Samuel Barrett, his new parole officer, to make an unannounced visit. As Barrett reported back, Manson and some of his hippie followers, mostly female, had found a haven at Wilson's home. Apparently, Wilson has succumbed to Manson's obsequious manner. Just how deeply had Wilson succumbed, though? Could it really be true that their delinquent parolee had sweet-talked a Beach Boy into giving him a record deal? McCocken must have relieved to hear from Nick Grillo, the Beach Boys manager, requesting anonymity. Grillo complained that Manson and his followers are proving to be a threatening factor to music company. The record label would have to be idiotic to have signed him. Hey, Cindy. I want to make that cheesy macaroni thingy that you had the other night. That looked really good. I want to make it. That's my goal for what is it? Today's what, Monday? Yeah, I'm thinking Thursday-ish. The parole officer decided that they had to order Manson back to San Francisco, making it clear that he'd return to prison if he failed to comply. On June 12th, Barrett sent a letter giving him 12 days to return. Someone must have intervened. There's no record of what happened between June 12th and June 24th deadline, but apparently the deadline evaporated. Imagine that. The next letters came in late July and early August, making no mention of the skipped deadline. McCocken reported to Washington, D.C., that he'd received a phone call from Manson, who had moved on to Swan Ranch, where he was receiving free room and board in exchange for his work as a ranch hand. By then, someone above Wall and McCocken said, and Barrett must have decided that it was best to just let Manson be. Wow. Manson built the family right under his federal supervisors' noses. From then on, the federal government, as well as local and state law enforcement, only backed further away from the group as they more brazenly broke the law. I'll never understand that, how they got away with that. The only one who didn't was Roger Smith. Well, after his supervision of Manson ended, he was still writing letters to the Mendocino County Court about Atkins and Brunner's sterling characters, and he was caring for Manson's son. Smith and his wife even hosted Manson at their home. Wow. With all I'd learned, I still couldn't grasp how a rock-ribbed Republican would fall with an aspirant hippie like Manson, and why their friendship persisted beyond the dissolution of their official relationship. Coda, the speed scene. Smith, Smith is Manson's old parole officer, which took, I guess, I don't know if it was ownership or adopted or what, but he's helped raising Mary Brenner's child. That's just weird. Yeah, they're caring for his son, Michael Valentine. Smith may have had an ulterior motives when he told Manson to move to Haight-Ashbury. As part of his criminology research, he'd been tapped to lead a study on amphetamines and their role in the violent behavior of Haight-Ashbury hippies. The National Institute of Mental Health funded the study. As they had in San Francisco, project in 1976, a FOIA request forced NIMH to acknowledge that it had allowed itself to be used by the CIA as a funding front in the 60s. Smith hoped to learn why some people, but not others, became psychotically violent on amphetamines and to see if their violence could be controlled. The goals of Amphetamine Research Project, ARP, as he dubbed it, were to illuminate three major areas of the speed scene: in the hate, the individual experiences, the collective or group experience, and the way in which violence is generated within the speed marketplace. Smith studied hippie collectives by observing them in their daily routines. And he enjoyed the researches to participate too. He enjoyed his researches to participate too. He later recalled that when he was appointed to lead the study, I took off my gray flannel suit and my wingtip shoes and grew a mustache. Soon the kids on Haight Street were calling me the friendly Fed and asking me to help them with the law. There's no indication that his technique proved useful because there's not much indication that the ARP ever happened at all. Wow. Smith never published his research. Two papers about the ARP were scheduled to appear in the Journal of Psychedelic Drugs, but they never materialized. The closest thing to a record of the ARP is Smith's unpublished dissertation, submitted to Berkeley's a month before the Manson murders. Even this, however, contains no actual participation of observation data. It is mainly secondhand anecdotes and statistical analysis. But the paper, The Marketplace of Speed, Violence and Compulsive Methamphetamine Abuse, does describe the nature of participant observation, which Smith wrote forced a social scientist to break the law. Hiding in a deviant group, he had to convince drug users he had to convince drug users that they can trust him with the information, which in other hands would place them in jeopardy. And perhaps most important, he must resolve the moral dilemma of being part of something which he may find morally objectionable at best. Probably by association, he could himself be arrested, and in a very real sense, he becomes a co-conspirator with information and insight which under normal conditions, the average citizen would be obliged to share with law enforcement. He must try to understand what individuals within the group feel, how they view the straight world, how they avoid arrest or detection. So by do what the fu so an ex-parole officer, or is he still a parole officer at this time? That's what I don't understand. And if he is, so he's doing drugs with hippies in Haight-Ashbury, so he can see what they feel and how they act and understand them and how they avoid arrest or detection? This is crazy. To ensure success, Smith argued, researchers had to protect their subjects from criminal prosecution, concealing their activities from the police and granting them anonymity in all reports. The ARP then had something resembling police immunity baked into its very wisdom. Very wisdom, very mission. Smith ran the ARP out of Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, which had just opened the previous summer. Soon, he was spending so much time there that he made a proposition to his only parole client. Instead of meeting with Manson in downtown San Francisco, where Smith had an office, why not just meet at the clinic? It was more convenient for both of them, and anyway, by the time Manson and his girls had started to contract sexually transmitted diseases, the clinic could treat those for free. Soon Manson became a mainstay at the HAFMC between visiting Smith and receiving medical care. There were some weeks when he appeared at the clinic every day. He became a familiar presence to a number of the doctors there, including several who, like Smith, had received federal funds to research drug use among hippies. Smith got the ARP off the ground at the same time he was supervising Manson for the San Francisco project. It was during this overlap that the record of Manson's parole supervision was either spotty, non existent, or later expunged. The funny, scruffy little visitor to the clinic, always with his routine of girls, was taking a ton of drugs and informing the family. By the time he and his followers turned up in that ditch by the side of the Pacific Coast Highway in April 1968, the girls had traded the flowers in their hair for steel knives, sheathed in leather and strapped to their thighs beneath long, flowing dresses. I was convinced that Roger Smith had played some part in this transformation. Now I began to wonder whether the HAFMC, with its emphasis on hippies, drugs, and research, had some role too. Well, I would definitely say yes, because this is wow. The Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic. Too many Smiths. To tell the story of Manson properly, as I'd argue Bugliosi never did, you've got to familiar yourself with a dauntingly large cast. As it is clear by now, when I was preparing to turn my aborted premiere story into a book, I realized just how frustrating it was to keep everyone straight, to tell the narrative in a way that gave its major players their due without getting mirrored in details. Because in such a sense, the details were everything. The Lacanian silence and seemingly irrelevant detours in Manson's life made it clear that he was far more a product of his times and his surroundings than something as outrageous as the helter-skelter motive would have you believe. That motive makes it seem like Manson and the family lived in a vacuum. But during their formative year in San Francisco, by most accounts, they were part of the zeitgeist. To understand that zeitgeist, no, zeitgeist, I had to deal with the sheer proliferation of names, hundreds and hundreds of names. It's a confusing story to tell because it involves two Smiths, and they ran in the same circles. Both were drug researchers with a sociological interest in Haight-Ashbury youth scene. On top of Roger Smith, Manson's parole officer, there was also David Smith, who relation the charismatic creator of the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic. Wait, that's something. You wouldn't think that Manson, a cherry ex-con who disdained conventional power structures, would spend a lot of time at a government-funded clinic, no matter how groovy its trappings. But Manson and the girls were at the HAFMC a lot. When they moved from the disused school bus into a proper department, he chose one right around the corner from the clinic. His involvement with that place and the extent to which it dovetails with both of the Smiths has been serially unexplored in popular writing on him. Because Bugliosi seemed to have no use for the Smiths, no one else did either. But having seen how crucial Roger was to Manson's development, I knew I had to dive into David's history too. Dr. Dave. David Elvin Smith grew up in the dusty farm community of Bakersfield, California, at the southern end of San Joaquin Valley. When he moved to the Bay Area in 1960 to study at US Berkeley, Smith was, by his own admission, a hick. He'd never traveled much beyond his backward town, and he lacked the political and intellectual curiosity that animated Berkeley's sophisticated international student body. Had it not been for his pushy peers, always scolding him for missing their sit ins and marches, Smith probably wouldn't have noticed the dawn of the free speech movement on his own campus. Later, he liked to remember a teaching assistant who canceled class so he and the other students could head to a protest downtown. Smith refused to join. He wanted to study for an upcoming test. The TA told him he'd never get an A if he didn't go. Smith has been open about his behavior in this period. An inveterate womanizer and a binge drinker. He appeared for days at a time on benders, nevertheless graduating at the top of his class. At the end of 1965, a debilitating blackout and a messy breakup led him to give up alcohol. By then, Smith, a raffish, good-looking man of 26, was a postdoctoral student at UC San Francisco and the chief of the alcohol and drug abuse screening unit at San Francisco General Hospital. Later, he remembered his curiosity flaring as his research collided with the city's cultural upheaval. I was injecting white rats with LSD in the lab, he said. What a son of a bitch. Oh, do you? I love doing that. Actually, I still have a couple more pork roasts I got really cheap. They were like $5 for fairly good size. Yeah. Yeah, I could go for some pulled pork. I think. So I was injecting white rats with LSD in the lab, he said, and then I'd walk home past the Haight where I see kids who were high on the same substance. He began to experiment with psychedelics himself, and he liked them. The lifestyle brought new friends and new politics. He and his friends tracked the burgeoning counterculture in the Haight, where some were predicting an influx of 100,000 young people in the coming year. Smith, who felt that healthcare was a right, wondered where the newcomers would receive medical attention and how they would afford it. He moved to Haight-Ashbury himself with plans to found a free clinic. When it opened at 555 Clayton Street in June 67, the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, HAFMC, was an immediate sensation. Staffed entirely by volunteers and unauthorized by the city health department, it treated hundreds of patients a day, offering non-judgmental care for those suffering from bad trips, overdoses, sexually transmitted diseases, and malnourishment, or for those who just needed a kind ear. Lines at the HAFMC sometimes stretched around the block with hippies waiting to ascend the creaky wooden stairs to its second floor office. Inside, loitering was encouraged. The clinic did everything it could to advise its psychedelic affinities. Exam rooms were painted in aqua and the day glow orange. One of them was wallpapered with a vibrant collage of peace signs, naked bodies, and hypnotic squirrels. Even as Smith struggled to pay the rent and keep the cops at bay, he reveled in its creation. Few things so perfectly encapsulated the utopian ideals of the summer of love. As faces filed in and out of the clinic that summer, Smith and his colleagues befriended the repeat visitors, and the HAFMC became a scene within a scene. It could be hard to tell the hippies apart with their long, bee-flowered hair and their upstart communes, their shifting legions of followers and leaders. But decades later, no one at the clinic had any trouble remembering Charlie Manson and his girls. 2 6-pound pork roasts the other day for $5 each, and 4 smaller ones. Yeah, must have been, I don't know, wholesale around everywhere. Because I got a few of them too. Perfect for pulled pork. Negate your ego. So in 1971, David Smith published Love Needs Care, a memoir of the HAFMC's germinal years. I found it rife with details about Manson and the family, and about the very period that Bugliosi had omitted from Helter Skelter, the summer of love, when Manson, apparently at his most charismatic, began to attract followers and ensure the unconditional devotion. Better still, Love Needs Care had a few contributions from Roger Smith, offering his own appraisal of Manson. This is so crazy that everybody is intertwined with Manson in some way or another. And all these authority figures are on his side helping him. It's just crazy to me. As invaluable as the portraits are, though, I called them into question with my reporting, leading to doubt both of the Smiths. The more I reread certain passages, the more they seemed like gingerly public relations efforts. The Smiths had to make it clear that they knew Manson well and that they felt some sympathy toward him. My God, I can't even read. And that they'd felt some sympathy toward him. There could be no denying that, given how often they've been seen together. But the book came 2 years after the murders, when both men had an interest in distancing themselves from that Manson, the murderous one, the metaphor for evil. Love Needs Care attempts the delicate task of elucidating the Smiths' relationships to Manson while making it seem as if they had no idea what he and his followers would someday erupt into unconscionable violence. David Smith described the family's frequent trips to the HAFMC when Charlie's girls, as they were known around the halls, were treated for sexually transmitted diseases and unwanted pregnancies. The girls tended to Manson's every need, never speaking unless spoken to. They referred to him as Christ or JC. It is crazy, right? When the family moved to an apartment on Cole Street, Manson began in earnest to reprogram his followers. David had an elaborate sense of Manson's tactics, although he never explained where he got it. Using a combination of LSD and mind games, Manson forced his followers to submit to unconventional sexual practices, Smith wrote. He would invoke mysticism and pop psychology as the acid took hold, saying, "You have to negate your ego." Treating the girls like objects, he eroded their independence, turning them into a self acknowledged, computer's empty vessels that would accept almost anything he poured in. Before long, they obeyed him unquestioningly. Yeah, good old brainwashing, right? Wow. Acid was unmistakably essential to the process. Manson's insistence on it sometimes put him at odds with trends in the Haight Ashbury, David thought. Typically, hippies who dropped a lot of acid eventually moved on to speed. A schism grew in the scene. The acid heads, praise David claims to have coined, favored nonviolence, whereas the speed freaks, ditto, caused the rash of violence that destroyed the Haight's live and let live ethos. But Manson had an aversion to the needles. He wouldn't use amphetamines. The family's drug pattern was effectively reversed, with Manson urging his disciples to replenish speed and embrace acid. Wearing his recruits from amphetamines reduced the chance of interference with his induction process. Speed became a part of the family's lifestyle only later, David told me, when it came time to kill in Los Angeles. He heard this from Susan Atkins herself when she asked him to assess her mental health for a parole hearing in 1978. When they went to the South, they got very deeply involved in speed, he said. They got it from the Hells Angels. They were trading sex for speed, and Atkins thinks that Helter Skelter and the ultimate crime was a paranoid speed delusion. That would make sense, though, right? Bugliosi kept any mention of the family's speed use out of the trial. Of course he did, because as we're going to know, he's a damn liar. David thought he understood why. It risked presenting mitigating circumstances for the prosecution, and the defense wouldn't want it coming up either. No one wants his or her clients to look like addicts. Both the Smiths have said that Manson's fear of needles made speed a non-issue, but obviously speed can be taken orally or snorted. Over the years, a smattering of evidence and firsthand recollections have suggested that the family used amphetamines more often than was suggested in the time. In a 2009 documentary, Linda Kasabian claimed that she and her companions each swallowed a capsule of speed before leaving for Cielo Drive on the night of Sharon Tate's murder. At the trial, she testified that she hadn't taken any drugs around the time of the murders. In books and at parole hearings, Susan Atkins also later copped to taking speed before the Tate murders. Tex Watson wrote that he frequently snorted it with the group and that he too took it on both nights of the murders. Others added that the family kept an abundance of speed at the Spawn Ranch toward the end of their time there, and that Manson himself wasn't above taking it, especially as he grew more paranoid. He would use it to stay up for days at a time, brooding over his delusions. Wow. Remember, Manson lived in Haight Ashbury because Roger Smith sent him there, thinking its vibes would assuage his ex-con's hostility. And make no mistake, Roger did believe that Manson was hostile. In a short essay for Life magazine published months after the murders, Roger offered the first ever insights about Manson. He speaks of Manson here out of his extensive unofficial contract with him. The magazine noted, without describing the nature of that contract or any potential conflict with the Smiths' parole duties, Charlie was the most hostile parolee I ever came across, Roger wrote. He told me right off there was no way he could keep the terms of his parole. He was headed back to the joint, and there was no way out of it. Roger would seldom write or speak about Manson again, wanting to distance himself from the most infamous client. When I first spoke to him in 2001, I was only the third reporter to do so, but his remark about Manson's hostility always stayed with me. I'd already seen, after all, how he characterized Manson in official parole documents as a well behaved guy making excellent progress. Disparity suggests that Roger had been willing to sweep Manson's hostility under the rug. In a passage he contributed to Love Needs Care, Roger did his best to support the idea that the bizarreries of Haight-Ashbury suited an ex-con like Manson. Daily LSD trips made him mellower, more thoughtful. He still had slick, duplicitous of a con man, and he was still a master manipulator. But he was suddenly found of vicious self-help bromides like, if you love everything, you don't need to think about what bothers you. Roger Smith couldn't seem too credulous, so he made sure to note the messianic tilt of Manson's acid days, an oblique acknowledgement of Charlie's growing megalomania. David Smith mirrored the sentiment, writing that Manson's LSD trips replaced his underlying depression with a manic smile that sometimes betrayed darker philosophies. David admitted that Manson began to develop a number of delusions as his involvement with LSD progressed. He fantasized about the Beatles ordaining him, their musical equal. He imagined a judgment day when blacks would slaughter whites. Some of Roger's familiars, including his wife, couldn't understand his affinity for Manson. Roger was pretty much in awe of Charlie's ability to draw these women to him, one said. Another thought that he was always kind of fascinated with the charming, charismatic sociopath. After Manson's role in the Tate LaBianca murders came out, Roger allowed that he made an error in bringing him to the Haight. But at the time, the family enjoyed a remarkable kingship with Roger. They swarmed over Roger Smith and often filled the clinic reception room, David Smith wrote, bringing operations to a standstill. Roger didn't mind the elation, in part, David claimed, because Charlie frequently offered him the services of his harem. Roger declined the offer, apparently, of his women. Among the HAFMC alumni I spoke to, the understanding was Manson had visited the clinic on many occasions to see Roger for their mandatory parole meetings. Roger himself would later claim that the family simply came by out of the blue for no particular reason, and that they didn't begin seeing him there until after his duties as Manson's parole officer had ended. In either case, something about the arraignment didn't sit well with me. One reason the HAFMC was free, after all, was that Dave Roger and their colleagues had received private and federal grants to conduct drug research there. The Smiths were both studying amphetamines and LSD, the latter being the crucial component in Manson's reprogramming process. How had an uneducated ex-con, someone who months ago had never taken acid and maybe never even heard of it, come to use the drug to such sophisticated ends? And wasn't it suspicious, at least, that he was coming to the HAFMC to see two people who were studying the very phenomenon, the use of drugs to control and change behavior? Huh. At least one friend of Rogers had foreseen that it would be a conflict of interest. Well, you would think. I always thought there would be problems. Another noted. Roger had really made a career at that point in trying to help Manson. He was going to soothe the savage beast. Instead, the beast grew more and more savage than ever. Frenzied attacks of unrelenting rage. When he launched the HAFMC, David Smith left a loose end dangling in his past. He'd never actually received his PhD in pharmacology. What? How the hell? This book gets more effed up by every page I read. He completed a 2-year research project on amphetamines and their efforts on groups of confined mice, but he never finished his dissertation. Although he shrugged off the lapse, he already completed medical school after all, and he'd taken quickly to his new life in Haight-Ashbury. It surprised many of his closest friends, and in our interviews, he was reluctant to admit it. It wasn't like him to leave something undone. Even in its unpublished form, Smith's research on mice defined him, creating the larger-than-life personality who would eventually be known as Dr. Dave. In my obsessive way, I found as much of this research as I could. I saw that Smith had published a brief article based on his study in the HAFMC's own house organ, the Journal of Psychedelic Drugs, in 1969. It wasn't nearly as robust as his full thesis would have been, but it gave me something to go on. Before long, I was noticing parallels between Smith's mice and the family. Mhm. At first, I was inclined to disregard these as a product of my more speculative side. I saw no purpose in linking the behavior of mice in a controlled experiment to the behavior of people and the world at large. But I took another look when I saw that Smith himself had made such a connection. He spoke of his mice as proxies for human beings. His research started with 16 albino mice. With the with the assistance of other researchers, he separated these two groups of 8 in a great setting, small, closely combined communities intended to simulate crowding. Then he injected the mice with amphetamines. Over the next 24 hours, they transformed from docile animals into frantic combatants, fighting one another until they died, either from injuries, self-inflicted wounds, from overgrooming, or simple exhaustion. That is so fucking cruel. Like, they didn't even have to do that. I'm sure you can find a bunch of hippies who would be willing to try it. The violence was unremitting. Smith described Brendy's attacks of unrelenting rage. Afterward, all that remained in the blood-spattered cages were scattered, dismembered body parts. Simply by confining the animals in close quarters, he'd increased the toxicity of the amphetamines more than 4 times. This is disgusting. In another attempt, some of the mice were dosed with other chemicals, mescaline, chlorpromazine, or the hell is even this, Respirpine, before they received amphetamine injections. The extra drugs sometimes had a sorting effect, segregating the mice that would kill them, that would kill from the mice that wouldn't, or they had a soothing effect, all but eliminating the violent tendencies. Smith told me he'd started his research having foreseen an influx of amphetamine abusers in San Francisco. He didn't say how. He predicted that influx, but he was right. In the summer of 67, as he opened the clinic, amphetamines exploded in popularity and hate. When the speed scene hit, it was a total shock to everybody, he told me. Suddenly, what I've learned in pharmacology related to amphetamines was applicable to people. Throughout Love Needs the Care, Smith draws parallels between the rodents he'd studied and sped-addled hippies in Haight-Ashbury. The mice on speed, he wrote, become inordinately aggressive and assaultive, turning upon one another with unexpected savagery. Their violent behavior is probably intensified by confinement, for it's strikingly similar to that observed in amphetamine abusers who consume the drugs in crowded atmospheres. In the Haight-Ashbury, Smith watched as people living cheek by jowl took huge doses of speed, inspiring paranoia and hallucinations. Once peaceful and well-adjusted, the speed freaks of San Francisco now lashed out with murderous rage at any real or imagined intrusion, assaulting, R-ing, or torturing to relive the paranoid tension. Cut off from the straight world, crammed together in inhuman conditions and controlled by chemicals, Smith concluded, they behaved quite naturally like rats in a cage. But when I spoke to Smith, he was quick to discount these parallels. I happened to study amphetamines before they hit the Haight, he said. The Haight-Ashbury didn't give me an idea. It's kind of like a historical accident. I was studying LSD before LSD hit the Haight streets too. In fact, according to Dr. Eugene Schoenfield, who participated in a portion of Smith's rat research in 1965, LSD was an integral component of the project. Smith and his colleagues would inject the rats with acid in hopes of making them more suggestible before he gave them amphetamines. Suggestibility was among the most prized effects of LSD from a clinical perspective, and yet Smith kept LSD out of the official documentation of his research. The article he published in the Journal of Psychedelic Drugs never mentioned acid. Well, what the hell? It was involved. I asked Smith if LSD was part of his protocol. He denied it. Then a moment later, without provocation, he reversed himself. Yeah, I stuck LSD in them, he said. But he couldn't explain why. I was sticking all different kinds of drugs in them, he added. In his recollection, LSD produced disorganized behavior, but not violent behavior. The rats just wander around in a daze. If you've noticed that I've used rats and mice interchangeably, there's a reason for that. Smith used them interchangeably. Two, even though the two species have vastly different behavioral patterns, especially in groups. In his Journal of Psychedelic Drugs article, he calls them mice. In Love Needs Care, and in another book he published, he calls them rats. Schoenfield insisted he'd worked with rats during his part of the research, but Smith was adamant that they were mice, and he couldn't explain his confusion on the subject. That's weird. Like the San Francisco Project and Roger Smith's Amphetamine Research Project, ARP, some of David Smith's research, according to his academic papers, was funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, which, as mentioned earlier, later acknowledged that the CIA used it as a front for LSD research. And through David, never mentioned in his writing, his work owed a clear debt to the landmark research of another NIMH psychologist, John B. Calhoun, who studied rat populations since 1946. Calhoun reported that rats in confined groups, even without drugs, became uncharacteristically aggressive. They erupt in murder, cannibalism, and infanticide. A dominant male rat emerged in the behavioral sink. Calhoun's term for his aggressive rat cultures, subjugating other males into a tribe of cowering, enfeebled followers and organizing female rats into a harem of sex slaves. Rats as sex slaves? Oh my. The strangest group to emerge was the probers, hypersexualized male rats that stalked and ard both males and females and often cannibalized their young. This is like a horror movie. This is disgusting. The probers would commit frenzied and berserk attacks against rat families sleeping in their burrows, leaving the remains of half-eaten victims. Again, no drugs were involved here. The probers emerged simply as a result of their confinement. They deferred only to dominant male rat, fleeing if he caught sight of them. Calhoun's study was a watershed. In the mid-60s, amid growing concerns about population density, social sciences, scientists, politicians, and journalists cited him to explain the riots in America's overcrowded ghettos. His term, behavioral sink, defined as the outcome of any behavioral process that collects animals together in unusually great numbers, aggravating all forms of pathology that can be found within the group, entered the scientific lexicon almost right away. David Smith used it extensively in his writing and in interviews with me. Though Smith never mentioned Calhoun by name, his research was essentially a continuation. He sought to control the pathologies of rats, or was it mice, in crowded environments by aggravating them with amphetamines. This is just like, I don't like that. I don't, a lot of people are just like, oh my God, who cares? It's rats, or I don't care. It's mice. Well, I do care. Hi, Sandy. This is gross. This is cruel. In crowded environments, by aggravating them with amphetamines, he concluded that amphetamines were more toxic to rats in groups than rats alone. Their crowding essentially exacerbated the effects of the stimulant. And this conclusion, like so much in Smith's research, confused me. I didn't see how it could be objective and unbiased. According to Calhoun, the rats' violence wasn't testified by confinement, but created by it. So, what difference did it make if Smith shot them up with amphetamines? Seemed like the equivalent of studying drunk, inexperienced ice skaters to learn about alcohol intoxication. The novice skaters were going to fall down on the ice anyway, regardless of whether they've been drinking or not. Plus, the more interesting subtleties of Calhoun's research, the emergence of a dominant male, a harem of subservient females, and an underclass of probers. All of which, it had to be said, sounded a lot like the family. Had gone entirely unnoted in Smith's project. I wondered if amphetamines, with or without LSD, had increased the dominant male's grip on his followers. Huh. Given how eerily Smith research prefigured the creation of the family under David's nose in the Haight Ashbury during the summer of 67, I wondered if he had deliberately underreported it. I would think so. I've never come close to proving that he did, but I haven't been able to explain the holes in it either. Why would he use LSD to induce suggestibility in rats before injecting them with amphetamines and making them berserk? Past a certain point, Smith had little interest in helping me sort it out. I was just talking about the parallels to what happened with the Manson family, I said. When I tried to describe your research, I just keep getting hung up on. Well, then why don't you just forget about the research then? Just delete the whole thing from your book. It was important, I said. You're spending way too much of yours and my time on it. Take what you want and reject the rest. That's not sus at all. The psychedelic syndrome. When Roger Smith joined forces with the HAFMC to begin the ARP, he was picking up where David left off. But this time, the research involved people. Oh my God. They're going to test amphetamines and LSD on people? Holy shit. This is what I wanted to know about the MK Ultra. I have a feeling we're close in here. This meant that both Smiths and Manson were often in the same place at the same time, with both Smiths having received funding from a federal institute later revealed to be the fucking CIA. Wow. It was, in a certain sense, coincidental, David said of the arrangement. Roger was the head of the Speed Project, and Charlie came to Haight-Ashbury and visited Roger. He didn't come to be part of the Speed Research Project. It was just that Roger happened to be his parole officer. Yeah, effing right. Details on the ARP and on the pharmacological goings-on at the HAFMC Medical Center, more generally, were hard to come by. The reams of record keeping you'd expect from clinical experimentation simply weren't there. Stephen Piddle, a forensic psychologist who worked with both Smiths at the HAFM, volunteered a stunning bit of information that Roger and David had neglected to share with me. The only thing I remember about ARP was that it got burglarized one night and Roger lost all of his files, Piddle told me. Their disappearance had been jarring in part because Roger was an unusually paranoid guy to begin with. He was especially skittish about Manson. After the murders, Roger refused to discuss him with anyone. Piddle assumed that Smith didn't want to be blamed for directing Manson to the Haight-Ashbury. He felt people were saying that he was the one who put the toxins into the environment. Well, I'm sorry, but from what I'm reading, I would think yes, he did. The HAFMC's Medical Center original chief psychiatrist, Dr. Ernest Dernberg, remembered the theft of the ARP files too. As he recalled, they'd gone missing right after the announcement of Manson's arrest for the Tate LaBianca murders, and that Roger, understandably, was pretty upset. Nothing else was taken from the HAFMC, which led the staff to believe that the police or some federal agency might have removed the files. Those were research papers, he reminded me. It didn't make sense for someone to steal these things when they didn't inherently have any value to the average individual. It seemed to have more of a nefarious purpose. The Smiths both denied that the theft had ever happened. You're dealing with aging memories, David said. But Denberg and Piddle, full-time doctors and credible sources, I thought, stood by their stories. They were absolutely stolen, Piddle said. Denberg, perturbed by David's insinuation about his faculties, told me more that he remembered it was a considerable amount of research. The premier amphetamine, research conducted at a street level. It would have been very important to the clinic, and it disappeared. Call David. Ask Roger if he has the files or knows where they are. Both men said they had no idea. What have survived are the many issues of the Journal of Psychedelic Drugs, the HAFMC's in-house research organ, still active to this day. David Smith founded in 67, and at various points, both he and Roger served on its editorial board. In the late 60s and early 70s, the journal printed a raft of articles by David and other clinicians about the long-term effects of LSD and amphetamines. One of these articles hoped to find out whether a dramatic drug-induced experience would have a lasting impact on the individual's personality. Another observed that feelings of frustration, anger, led people to want to try LSD. The soil from which the flower children arise, the author wrote, is filled more with anger and aggression, thorns and thistles, rather than passion and petunias. Under emotional pressure, Acid could induce images and sensations of anger or hate magnified into nightmarish proportions. David Smith had studied these same phenomenon, formulating an idea that he called the psychedelic syndrome, first articulated in 1967 or early 68. The gist was that acid, when taken by groups of like minded people, led to a chronic LSD state that reinforced the interpretation of psychedelic reality. The more often the same group of friends dropped acid, the more they encouraged one another to adopt the worldview they discovered together on LSD, thus producing dramatic psychological changes. Usually, the psychedelic syndrome was harmless, but regular LSD use could cause the emergence of a dramatic orientation to mysticism. And in people with pre-psychotic personalities, Smith wrote, LSD participated a long-term psychological disorder, usually a depressive reaction to a schizophrenic process. Had Smith seen the syndrome in the family? After Manson had been arrested for the murders, David wrote, Charlie could probably be diagnosed as ambulatory schizophrenic. He said the same thing when I asked about Manson. I felt that he was schizo. It was Roger Smith who'd had the better diagnosis and the earlier one, David maintained. Roger said that he knew from day one that Charlie was a psychopath. But Roger apparently never thought it was necessary to intervene, to send his parolee back to prison, or to get him proper psychiatric care. Instead, he sent him to hate Ashbury and watched him drop acid every day, accruing suggestible young followers as he went. Meanwhile, David was studying the exact psychological conditions that gave rise to the Manson family while he treated them at his clinic. Bugliosi had erased all of these facts from a history of the group. I didn't know any of this. This is insane. Roger Smith knew that the stereotype of the addict had a lot of potency in the popular imagination. Casual drug users were regarded as inherently criminal, a tear in the fabric of society. The public sphere of such people was easily manipulated. In 1966, the year before Manson was released from prison, Smith published a criminology paper called Status, Politics, and the Image of the Addict, examining the propaganda that has stigmatized Chinese, or Oriental as he put it, opium smokers in San Francisco in the early 20th century. Citing police files and strategy manuals, Smith described an organized effort to cast opium addicts, who were by and large peaceful, as insidious deviants who posed a threat to society. To this end, some agents were assigned to pose as drug addicts and infiltrate the opium scene. Their objective was to characterize the addicts as dangerous individual, likely to rob, or plunder in his crazed state. And it worked. The once invisible opium users of San Francisco's Chinese ghettos were, by 1925, depicted in the media as crazed dope fiends. The shift in public perception allowed the police to crack down on the Chinese population, deporting or institutionalizing the undesirables. Smith neither valorized nor condemned these efforts, but he noted that they were effective. The Orientals, he wrote, were viewed as a threat to the existing structure of life in this country. Tainting their image meant they could be differentiated and degraded to the satisfaction of society. It's not hard to see how such research could be applied to Haight-Ashbury hippies in the late 60s. Most Americans frowned on acid, as they frowned on all drugs, but it took Charles Manson to give LSD new and fearsome dimensions. Suddenly, it caused violence, and the hippies who used it were perceived as wild-eyed and dangerous, where once they'd been harmless and pleasure seekers. The HAFMC's goal, free healthcare for everyone, was an unpreachable part of the hippie ethic, and there could be no doubting that David Smith and his volunteer doctors had improved the community. But just because this clinic had free in its name didn't mean that it had no cost. The place served as a gateway between the hippie world and the straight world, affording doctors a closer look at the hierarchies and nuances of the counterculture. In exchange for their free healthcare, patients were held up to the light and scrutinized by eager researchers, David Smith chief among them. Emmett Grogan, the founder of the Diggers, was one of a few observers who saw something amiss behind Smith's idealism. The Diggers were an Antichrist group known for providing food and housing and medical aid to runaways in the Bay Area. Smith liked them, and he worked with them at a free infirmary based out of their happening house. It inspired in his own clinic. But as Grogan wrote in his 1972 memoir, the admiration wasn't mutual, at least not for long. Smith soon began his own self aggrandizement. He appeared more concerned with the pharmacology of the situation than with treating the ailing people who came to him for help. Grogan noticed that he kept detailed records about drugs and their abuse. Then he used to secure funding for the HAFMC, which he opened only 6 weeks after he joined the Diggers operation. Grogan saw that the HAFMC's permission or mission statement right away. Just because no one was made to pay a fee when they went there didn't make it a free clinic, he wrote. On the contrary, the patients were treated as research subjects, and the facility was used to support whatever medical innovations were new and appropriate to this agency. This is messed up. Of course, one of these patients was Manson, who became one of David Smith's research subjects as well. He was such a special case that Smith tracked him far beyond the walls of the HAFMC, sending his top researcher all the way down to Los Angeles, where Manson and his ranks of followers had set up shop on the time-worn western set of the Spawn Ranch. The group marriage commune. You might remember the name of Alan Rose. It was Rose who dropped everything and went to Mendocino County in '68 when several of Manson's followers wound up in jail there. That trip was only a pre-high to his deeper involvement with the family, which saw him in bed with the group to study their sexual dynamics or just to get laid, depending on whom you ask. Rose was a friend of Roger Smith. He'd helped set up the ARP, but he was even closer to David Smith, who told me Al was like my disciple, and I was like his father. A former rabbinical student, Rose had dropped out of college in Ohio to move to the Haight Ashbury in '66 when he was 21. He became the HAFMC's head administrator and research assistant at various times to both Smiths. Rose and David went on to co author 3 studies of the Haight Ashbury drug culture in the Journal of Psychedelic Drugs. Like the Smiths, Rose had an intuitive grasp of the population and clinicians' knowledge of the drugs they were taking, even though he had no formal medical training. While reserved and socially awkward by many accounts, Rose enjoyed the Haight Ashbury, especially its sexual openness. He felt inexperienced in that regard, and he hoped he could change that when Roger introduced him to Manson and the girls, who were coming by the clinic with increasing frequency. Rose was enamored. He decided, along with David, that they'd make for good research subjects. But already they were the question of its impartiality. The legend around the HAFMC was that the girls had seduced Rose, probably on Manson's orders. When in June 1968, Manson hand selected a number of his group to accompany him to Los Angeles, Rose may have feared that the year-long party was drawing to a close. He invited the remaining women to move into Haight Ashbury home, where he could tend to their needs until Manson summoned them. It was then that some of the girls headed to Ukiah for their ill-fated recruitment effort. When they landed in jail, Rose jumped at the chance to rescue them. As David Smith described the episode in Love Needs Care, Rose outed himself, visiting the girls daily and fetching candy and cigarettes for them. Mary Brenner, the mother of Manson's newborn son, was still lactating. The other girls made a habit of going naked and sucking the milk from her breast. Oh my gosh, that is disgusting. Sorry, trigger warning. Shit. Hey, Nan. This rattled the jail staff, but Rose vouched for the girls. Outside the jail, he kept busy by consulting with lawyers on a courtroom strategy and preparing his testimony as a character witness. All the while, he was living on money funneled to him by David. When the case was resolved, the girls made tracks for the Spawn Ranch, not wanting to keep Manson waiting. By now, it seemed, Rose couldn't bear to part with them. He elected to go too, and then he stayed with them for 4 months. Was this a business trip or vacation? It's up for debate just how totally Rose succumbed to the family's power. Judging from the published accounts of his time with them, he was more an enabler than a blind devotee. Somewhat opaquely, David wrote that Rose was both a sympathetic cousin and a sociologically oriented participant observer in the strange communal phenomenon. Roger Smith had used that term, participant observer, too, for his ARP. He endorsed looking the other way when one's subjects broke the law. Did the same laxness apply to Rose at the Spawn Ranch? David provided varying and sometimes contradictory accounts of Rose's role in the family, and he lost his temper when I tried to set the record straight. The first time we spoke, he admitted that Al became entraptured, and their philosophy and he traveled with them. Rose dropped acid with the family, Smith said, and then 6 of the girls just fucked his brains out, and he saw God. He borrowed some money from me and he didn't pay it back, and it turned out he gave it to Charlie. So it was, like, very weird. Other sources also remembered Rose having some kind of ecstatic sexual encounter with the family. Yeah, I am. Yeah, that part bugged the shit out of me. I'm sure you knew it would. Yeah, it bugged me. But at some point, I'm going to end this real soon. I'm just going to read the rest of this page. But at some point, the appeal of the group waited for him, and he left. He came back, Smith said. I can't really say he got kicked out. He just said he was no longer part of it. And yet, when I revisited the matter with Smith a few years later, he said, I don't know if Al went to Spawn Ranch. When I reminded him that he said otherwise, he made a grudging concession. He was with them 4 weeks, max. So I tracked down Rose himself, who told me in a phone call that he was at the ranch for probably 3 or 4 months. Rose was shocked that I wanted to talk to him. Only one other journalist had been in touch, and I found him nonchalant about his time with the family. More than either of the Smiths, he came across as mild, somewhat naive, and unassuming. His memories of the late 60s had their edges smooth like stones in the sea. Of course, he remembered the girls. They had a level of self confidence and dynamism that was pretty amazing, he said. They could walk into stores and get checks cashed without ID, okay? And he remembered the power that Manson exuded, recalling a man whose raw charisma was by then tainted with egotism and Racism. No, don't be sorry. It's not your fault at all. Still, he obeyed Manson, sincerely feeling that his destiny was going with Charlie and the girls. He added, we're all pretty impressionable, very idealistic. Charlie convinced me I didn't need glasses. I stopped wearing them. He'd have me drive the bus up and down the LA freeway. I really had no strain, or I really had to strain. What had finally made him leave the Spawn Ranch was in an incident in which Manson picked up a prostitute from the freeway and paraded her in front of his followers, saying that he wouldn't have sex with her because she wouldn't give him head. And I just saw that as such an abuse of the power he had. It was late autumn 1968 when Rose returned to the Haight. He moved in with Roger and his wife, Carol, in Tiburon and assisted in writing up 2 studies. The first was Roger's ARP dissertation. The second was called The Group Marriage Commune, a case study, co authored with David Smith, the first ever scholarly study of the Manson family. David and Rose believed that they had a major research paper on their hands, bolstered by Rose's firsthand observations of the family. The first published remarks about their study appeared 6 weeks after the family was charged with the murders in January 1970. Interviews Smith gave to Berkeley Bar, an alt weekly. The front page story was headlined MD on the Manson sex life psychologist who lived with Manson family tells about commune. Smith discussed Rose's 4 months on the ranch, but he never indicated that his co researcher had been a follower of Manson. Intentionally or not, Smith gave the impression that Rose's time with the family was a part of a planned study. In fact, they decided to write about the family only after Rose left the commune, a point they refinessed later. And even though Rose was a psychologist referred to in the headline, he wasn't, of course, a real psychologist. Smith didn't let him do any of the talking. Instead, the reporter quoted portions of their scholarly paper, noting that Smith had pulled the article from the presses as soon as he learned that its subjects had been accused of mass murder. Their paper was eventually published in the Journal of Psychedelic Drugs in September 1970. It distanced the HAFMC from Rose's involvement with the family, and it never identified Manson by his last name, leaving the reader to make the connection. Participation in the commune at the time of Rose's involvement, read the introduction, was not associated with academic observation, and only after leaving the communal setting was thought given to description. To the authors of any responsibility for the murders, it fudged the facts about Charlie claiming that during our observation, he expressed a philosophy of nonviolence. LSD-induced psychedelic philosophy was not a major motivational force. Smith further downplayed the family's connection to the HAFMC by claiming that they only spent 3 months living in the Haight-Ashbury, during which their primary residence was a bus. In fact, the family lived in the Haight-Ashbury for more than a year, 2 blocks from HAFMC, and after Manson took some followers to Los Angeles, the others moved into Rose's home. The paper asked why these young girls were so attracted and captivated by disturbed mystics such as Charlie. That was a great question. Past a certain point, it seemed Rose and Smith had no mention of answering it. Their paper detailed Manson's abusive, controlling methods, especially his sexual tactics, but it steered clear of their true area of expertise, LSD. Most egregiously, the paper was never updated to mention the Tate LaBianca murders, even though it was published a full year later. The defining event of the commune that Rose had infiltrated was nowhere to be found. That is crazy. No, everyone's been quiet. All right, I'll read that tomorrow. I've only got so much left. I don't know if you can see. There. So I read all this, and then I just got this. So it's going quickly, which is good because then I won't forget. No one being quiet because you, I promise. Whew. Yeah, that mice one, that was really annoying. No, it was annoying. It was heartbreaking. I don't care if they're mice or rat. I still don't know if they're mice or rats or mice and rats. They never really said. Just sad. Just the way they described that. They tore each other apart and they were using them as sex slaves. Like, what the fuck? Is that the part you were like trying to warn me about, Nan? And then it kind of it didn't touch on MK Ultra, but it touched on LSD and experimenting on not only the rats and mice, but people, like Manson's um family. There's an elephant? Shit. Oh my gosh. What the hell? That's crazy. That not even great. That's just disgusting. Yeah. The I know you don't like rats or mice. You laughed at me when I told you my story when I sucked up a mouse. Oh my God, I'll still never forget that. I still feel like shit for that. No worries, SD. It gets into MK show a little bit. Okay. I hope nothing's wrong. Sorry if it is. You tell I'm Canadian. I always say sorry for everything. Oh, I don't know, last year sometime or last winter, I think it was. Oh, right on, Snoops. I was vacuuming and I apparently had a little tiny mouse that I didn't know about, just this little baby. And I guess I sucked it up with my vacuum and it stayed in there until the next time I vacuumed. And so when I went to even go near my vacuum, I smelled something like awful. And I'm like, what the fuck? I look and I was like, oh my God, there's a fucking mouse in there. So I freaked out and I had to like scrub it. Oh, I've never smelled anything like that. Death. So I sucked him up and he died in there. And I cried and I was so upset. And I was telling my mouse story. I was live and Teresa's laughing at me. I'm on the verge of tears. I feel like crap. She's laughing at me. And then do you remember that time, Teresa, when I was trying to give away my friends? Because I didn't want them to be exterminated. Oh my God. Yeah, that's how I am. I just love every animal. Animal lover, big time. She's like, nobody wants your rats. He was half serious, okay? No, I had a rat issue. It didn't they're all gone now though. Yes, it was a mouse. And you're bugging me about my rats. That was pretty funny though, because she said nobody wants your rats, Nikki. It's like, but I don't want them to get like exterminated. Miss Snoops put two small pork roasts in the crock pot, so mine is easy. I made smothered burritos last night, so I was so tired and so afterward that I wasn't doing that again. Sounds amazing though. My mom was afraid of mice when we lived on the farm. My mom would scream and I would have to get the mice. Really? Yeah, I'm glad my son's older because now he has to deal with them if we ever get one, which we don't. If we do, I probably won't even know about it because my one cat, Ash, he's a mouser. Yeah, you would have laughed at me too, I know. I'm sitting there worried about the rats underneath my house that the exterminators came in and brought the black boxes to have them exterminated, right? And I'm sitting there worrying, like, do you guys want a rat? What am I gonna do? Go out there and grab one? No. I ain't going near them. Them bastards were like, they were huge. I just felt bad. It wasn't their fault. They tore down all these trees and all this wildlife, and they didn't even research like who was like what lived there. There was coyotes, obviously there was wolves, there was any type of wildlife, birds, freaking bees, insects, rabbits, foxes, you name it. And they tore it all down without rehoming them, raccoons, and all of a sudden like my whole like this whole area was just flooded with all these animals. They had nowhere to go. It was so sad because they ended up killing it, all of them. We didn't need that flipping wall anyways. It doesn't do anything. I still hear everything. I didn't want the wall. I said no. Apparently, a lot of us said no, and they did it anyways. So I don't know why we even had a vote in it. All right, I'll go. Or I should go anyways. What time's it? I still gotta make my son's lunch. That and I'm kind of getting hungry. I want a little snack because I'm seeing burritos and everything else. The right foot is getting numb. You know, I'm just seeing. Oh, I know. Really, SD? I just hope they don't kill them. Like everything here is being like is becoming endangered because of the killings and just taking over their homes. No, I didn't end up getting it because they wouldn't answer their phone. They close at 9 o'clock, 9 p.m. apparently, and I called at 8:30, they wouldn't answer. I called at 1:45, they wouldn't answer. So I called at 5:02, they wouldn't answer. So I didn't get no pizza. No, I ended up having soup. You had hamsters. I taught them tricks and my mom didn't like them, but they are freaking cute, especially those little teddy bear hamsters. They're adorable. Feral hogs too. They're kind of dangerous, aren't they? Like they're really mean and territorial, aren't they? Shoot. I just even still I wouldn't want to see any of them harmed. You're sad? It's okay. It's fine. I'll just give them shit. I know them well enough that I'll give them shit. Say next time you see my number, you fucking pick up this one. I want a pizza. I want a pizza. All right, I gotta go. I gotta go to yeah, they were. I gotta go to the phone booth anyways. So I hope you guys have a great night. Thank you for joining me. And I'll see you tomorrow. I'll be back at 7. With Nana. With none, as usual. She's just busy tonight. All right, you guys have a great night. Bye.
I know you told your friend you're not okay. And tell me what's wrong and why you never said you felt that way. And guess you're trying to stay strong and fake a smile until I look away. But I've known you too long, it hurts to watch your blue eyes fade to gray.